Hello, one and all, and welcome back to the 425 podcast and to the final installment on how to love your wife as Christ loved the church. Let's start with a brief review of what we've covered so far. To begin with, it was important to establish a more biblical view of Jesus Christ than the modern church currently espouses. That biblical understanding informs us how he actually loves the church and how that love more resembles the love of a strong, corrective father than an indulgent, interminably tolerant boyfriend, a perspective that appears to be hiding in plain view from the modern church. The biblical reality disabuses us of any notion of this make-believe Harlequin Jesus, the fabricated version of Christ who serves as an all-powerful beta simp in the lives of Christian women, a white knight who demonstrates love by enforcing women's social privilege. That privilege puts men under the control of women. It's totally contrary to God's prescribed hierarchy, not to mention the fact that it usually ends tragically. What else can we expect from a model that dares even to put God in a service role to women's lust for control? Just look at the modern church. Legions of church deacons, elders, pastors, priests, indeed the Pope, have become lap dummies on behalf of female ventriloquists, shaming men who don't submit to women's desires, and even those who do, just to keep them in line. This steers us, rather pointedly I'd say, away from the tough love Christ showered on the church and toward the satanic. Wrong direction if you ask me, but hey, it's responsible for one of the few revenue streams the church has left. So there's that. As we saw in an abundance of Scripture, Harlequin Jesus, while enjoying a robust following in the modern church, never existed. We have to return to the Christ of the Bible and His Word for solutions to the problem of contentious, disrespectful women, and when we do, the answers become crystal clear. We see that at the very least we need to emulate Christ's rejection and rebuke of sin and withdraw fellowship as a matter of principle and corrective, loving discipline. What I didn't say in the previous segments of this talk, but will now, is that we're currently a very, very long way from the capability of this kind of loving discipline in the average Christian man. Truth is, the very notion of correcting your wife remains a taboo discussion, strictly verboten, courtesy of the romantic gynocentrism that muzzles almost all people of faith. If you take a look right now at most Christian content creators, the allegedly edgy Christ pill crowd that vociferously condemns feminism and challenges men to cough up masculine frame, do they even attempt to broach this subject? Nope. Even the ones being vocal about the questionable credibility of born-again women with 3-digit body counts in the church, none of them, and I do mean none, break the no-talk rule. Do you think Jordan Peterson will ever talk about how a man should correct his wife? That man can't even correct his own daughter. When was the last time you heard Andrew Wilson talk about correcting Rachel, or about any man correcting his wife for that matter? Personally, I never have, but if I've missed something, please let me know in the comments and I'll gladly make a public apology for the error. I'm not holding my breath, though. The point that I've been making in this series of talks is that without a man who will correct them, as well as showing love in other ways, women's natural tendency is to cut a path of destruction through a marriage. That destruction is fueled by disrespect, almost all of it initiated by the woman and tolerated by the man. As I said in an earlier segment of this talk, every failing marriage I've ever seen was mired in the quicksand of chronic disrespect. And as far as I can tell, the only possible solution is the consciously enforced standard of respect, led by the man who sets the example and holds himself to the same standards to which he holds his wife. In making this assertion, I don't take into account anything about what the wife will do or not do in response. To me, her response is irrelevant, regardless of what it is. A man acting righteously need not and should not concern himself with the reaction to it from anyone, including his wife. Otherwise, we're just saying that we'll do God's will as long as the wife approves. That's the Harlequin Jesus way. As a matter of fact, Scripture tells us in many places that those who follow the true Christ, and therefore his commands, are guaranteed to receive negative reactions aplenty. Matthew 10:22 tells us, "You will be hated by all because of my name, but it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved." There are many similar passages, all of which point to hostility from the world in response to allegiance to God and His Word. Thankfully, we are also promised the eternal reward for holding fast. So, from the outset, it's important to point out that the big picture here, the scriptural picture, God's picture, if you will, is completely indifferent to the world's response, including from disrespectful wives. However, while things are that simple, they clearly aren't always that easy, especially for men married with children and whose alleged marital covenant with God actually falls under the purview of the state. On my last segment of this talk, one of the comments posed a question about this rather harsh reality. That question from Joachim, sorry, but I'm pretty sure I butchered the pronunciation, reads as follows. What if standing up for yourself in all cases to the fullest extent, he asks, results in divorce and your children won't have a dad around and are getting raised by the woman? Wouldn't God expect the man to endure what is prescribed in Proverbs, thereby self-sacrifice himself for the children? These are really fair questions, and although I still stand by my position that doing what's right scripturally isn't negotiable, they deserve a more thoughtful answer than that from me. While I won't rely on this exclusively, I want to begin with some questions of my own, starting with, what if you're role modeling holding your tongue and taking abuse in front of your children for all their developmental years? What sort of example of masculinity and fatherhood are you presenting? What will it teach your daughters? How will it shape their expectations of men? How would those expectations shape their marriages when they enter adulthood? Wouldn't this passive acceptance of the mother's sinful ways just fuel the continuation of a generational pattern of abuse? In truth, I ask these questions rhetorically because I already know the answer. Abuse and tolerance of abuse are characteristics of dysfunctional families that are passed along generationally, learned behaviors that infect one generation after another, visiting misery and family failure on children until someone in that lineage puts a stop to it. Those who don't put a stop to it are only ensuring the dysfunction will continue. That's every bit as true as it is uncomfortable to consider. So, when pondering what God's will may or may not be in this kind of situation, I think it's fair to expect men to ask themselves some hard questions. First, what will it teach your sons to see a father with weak or even non-existent boundaries? Should you set them up by way of your personal example to normalize and accept the same kind of disrespect in their marriages? I also submit to you, dear listener, that you have to ask yourself what positive influence is a man in a home where he is openly, chronically disrespected. I think that's a fair question and one that needs to be answered, as I've spoken with thousands of men who were turned into objects of derision under their own roofs. I have yet to have even one tell me that he looked back and decided that living with it was the right thing to do. Not a single one. Most of these were men who played the doormat, with the family reading that behavior as an invitation to wipe their shoes clean on his back. Also, I have to note that it was implied in the original question that standing up for oneself necessarily resulted in an absent or alienated father. All I can say is that if that's the kind of woman a man married, the alienation has already begun. To Joachim's question, she is already raising the children without his influence. It matters not if he's in the home or somewhere else. It's a mistake to think that parental alienation begins with divorce. That's never the case. Contentious, disrespectful women use children as pawns and spousal surrogates long before the paperwork is ever filed. The guy who hangs like a piñata in the midst of all that isn't improving a single thing. He's just setting a bad example. I also have to call out something else, but first I want to make it clear that this isn't at all about ascribing any personal motive to Joachim for his question. I know absolutely nothing about his life or circumstances, not a clue, and I won't insult him or you by pretending otherwise. But just speaking from general experience, I've talked to many men, too many actually, who hide their unwillingness to assert themselves under their own roof to, and I put this in air quotes, protect the children. It's cowardice masquerading as concern. It's weakness of the worst kind posing as the silent suffering of some kind of martyr. And it's a way for those men to rationalize and excuse the horrible example they set for their children and, for that matter, their wives. I think this also goes a long way toward uncovering what most weak husbands mean when trying to claim their lack of spine is somehow God's will. I'm not buying it. Now, I am certainly no authority on God's will in any man's life but my own, and I barely know what God's will is in my own life most of the time. But I am happy to share the formula I use in that area, if it is at all helpful. When confronted with a challenge in sorting out what I believe about God's will, I do three things. I first consult Scripture, then I pray for guidance, for God's will to be revealed in my life about whatever it is I'm facing, and I consult with other Christian men, red pill Christian men. I listen to and consider what they say, and then, if I feel moved by God into a particular direction, that's what I try to do. When I don't feel a push in any direction, I just do the best I can. It's my best guess, however, that when it comes to things God expects us to endure, all those things are what we endure for following His commands, not for ignoring them. It's clear to me from Scripture and from things that have transpired in my own life that God doesn't expect or want me to live under a woman's heel. But brothers, if any of you truly feel it is God's will for you to stay in a marriage with no foundation of respect, then I urge you to reject every last word you hear from me or anyone else on this topic, except to say, please do your best to challenge yourself, to make sure that you're aware of your motive and not just seeking a way to avoid the unpleasantness that Scripture assures us will come with obedience to God, even if that unpleasantness is the wrath of a woman scorned. With that, I conclude this series on how to love your wife as Christ loved the church, at least for now. It's a huge topic, and I'll no doubt want to revisit it in the days ahead. In closing, I want to reiterate how important it is to reach young men with an alternative to the romantic agitprop that now passes for church doctrine. If you know young men coming of age, please refer them to these talks and this Substack. The romantic narrative is incredibly powerful, so it may do no good whatsoever. But you never know when you're saving a life simply by speaking up. After all of us here suffered the same ignorance at some point in our lives, and it changed for us simply and radically just by hearing another point of view that resonated with us more than current mainstream thinking. Every time you share this and other red pill material with young men, they are given a chance to head off so many terrible problems before they happen. To me, that's worth the risk and the effort. Good night, brothers. I'll see you next week.